KCRW sponsors include A24, presenting Moonlight, a film chronicling 3 chapters in the life of a young black man, discovering his identity and experiencing first love as he moves from childhood into manhood. In theaters now.
Hi, I'm Elvis Mitchell, and thanks for listening to The Treatment. Some of the most entertaining stories produced today, however, are not on the big screen, but they can be heard on KCRW's Unfictional. Intimate stories and artful documentaries crafted by some of the most talented radio producers across the world. Check it out. You can find Unfictional on KCRW's iTunes page. From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, it's The Treatment. Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. I wanted to have my guest writer, director Rick Famuyiwa on for a while, going back to the days when he got his start as an independent, sort of low-budget filmmaker, not really independent, with The Wood. And now a scant 16 years later, he's broken through as an independent filmmaker with this film that was the toast of Sundance, a film he wrote and directed. The film is dope. First of all, Rick, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me. Pleasure.
And it's so funny now, why dope as a title? Because it's almost... it's taking on all of the permutation nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, that was part of by design. I think that there's different levels to the film and different things that I wanted to deal with in the film, and meanings and perceptions versus reality, that, the idea of dope in this film means a lot of different things, both literally in terms of what these characters have to kind of deal with and unload.
And deal, literally.
Deal with, yeah. And just in terms of 90s slang, which is where it comes from, and these characters that are obsessed with 90s hip-hop and 90s culture in general. And so, dope has multiple meanings, both, and I think we see them all on display in this movie.
So tell the audience, because the movie's about to be released after playing Sundance. Tell the audience what the movie's about.
It was really about just this idea that I was playing with, that kids who grow up in these neighborhoods never have good or bad choices. It's usually bad or worse choices. And as much as these kids are similar in many ways to the kids in the John Hughes films that I grew up on and really loved, the consequences of bad actions and mistakes aren't quite the same for, the geeks in those movies as they are when you live in a place called The Bottoms in Inglewood. And so it's really just about these kids living their lives and trying to do what a lot of kids do, find their voices, and in particular with our main character, Malcolm, find his voice. He wants to go to college, he wants to go to Harvard, and that's sort of his dream, to kind of get out of his environment and go to Harvard. But there's a hard road to that when you come from a place like Malcolm. And in humor and sort of, and also truth, I wanted to deal with that with dope. So that's sort of where it comes from.
But it's funny, too, because the movie packs a lot of story, and more story than you've done before. Generally, your films, be it The Wood or Brown Sugar, are more character pieces that are in their way coming-of-age stories. But coming-of-age stories for adults, people have to really make the decision to leave these kind of archetypal childhood behind. And this is a much more literal coming-of-age story. This one is about teenagers, but it's more openly funny. I mean, it's really a comedy, but it's... And there have been glimpses of this in your past movies. People who have sort of a sense of irony about their relationship to blackness.
Yeah. And it was one of those things that I wanted to deal with, because I felt like in comedy, especially, and you're dealing with black characters or characters of color, we sort of fell into the romantic comedy as the device for that expression. And it came out of a reaction to a lot of the cinema that was happening prior to, sort of the explosion of these black romantic comedies. But
and then those black romantic comedies, and you made
I was part of it.
They were aspirational.
Exactly.
They were about being part of the middle class and the bridge to the next generation of the middle class.
Yeah, exactly. And so it was very much sort of a reaction to the 90s films that I think I'm paying homage to in Dope. And so, when I got to Dope, it was really about this idea that whenever you're dealing with these situations and these types of films, irony and sort of, these sort of winks and quirkiness is something that you never really get a chance to explore. Mainly because, I think like in a situation like the characters in Dope and they're in these really tough environments, they are so serious and the consequences of their lives are so serious that sometimes that's the direction that naturally people respond to. But, I grew up in Inglewood and had to sort of navigate things each and every day. And I didn't sit there and say, oh, my God, my life is so terrible. You're a kid and you're growing up and you're just in your environment. And as I looked back on a lot of the crazy things that me and my friends would get into and get out of, I would look back and think, wow, that was hilarious, and you find yourself laughing at moments when literally I'd be coming home from school and one time I went to the local corner store and while I'm getting my Slurpee and whatever else, in the back it gets robbed. I hear commotion up front and I realize it's getting robbed. And so I'm sitting there with my chips and my Slurpee and I'm at the door and they don't see me and I'm about to walk out and the thought that pops into my head is, if I walk out of this door, I'm actually stealing this stuff, and I'm thinking, and so I sat there for like it seemed like 5 minutes, but it was probably more like a second in my mind debating whether I should put back the Slurpee and chips or just run out. And so I eventually just ran out. But I just sat there and thought, you moron, you're sitting here in a place that's getting robbed, worried about whether if you take this Slurpee and chips, you're going to be an accessory or a part of it. And I saw that as kind of funny when I look back on it. Like, these are the kind of things you look back and you almost have to have humor about it because they're so ridiculous. And you tell that story and I can't help but laugh at it. And so that became kind of the perspective that I wanted to use in Dope, is that there's almost a gallows humor that you develop when you grow up in a place like this. And I think that humor then gets you to a truth that sometimes is easier to get to through comedy than it is through sort of straight drama. So
it's the treatment. I hope the statute of limitations is worn off for my guest writer-director, Rick Famuyiwa, whose new film as writer-director is Dope, which played at the Sundance Film Festival this year. As you're talking, though, and just looking at the films, there's always a sense of awareness and being of two minds that your characters have. I mean, that sort of awareness of the way that they're perceived and the awareness of the way that they perceive themselves. Yeah. And in generational terms, this is a much more modern take on that awareness than you used in the past.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I was very interested in the idea of perception versus reality, and the perception that we bring to the table as an audience member about who these kids are, the perception that these kids have of themselves, and then ultimately how they use that for their benefit in the movie, and I use that as a filmmaker to sort of put the mirror on the audience as I take them through this journey. And I think they are very aware of how they're perceived versus, who they think they are. And I think that was very much a thematic idea that I was dealing with, is that
it's a thematic idea that goes back to all your films, but it's just used in in a really modern way this time around.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's more of a mature way. I got into the business pretty young. I was fresh out of film school, probably a year out when I did The Wood, and I think there are a lot of these ideas that I was dealing with in that film and in other films that I think almost 16, 17 years later, I've sort of thought more about. I've grown and sort of focused on, what this means in terms of black film and black characters in film. And so I feel like I was at a point when I got to Dope that I was ready to sort of add on to that thesis that I'd already sort of started before. But now I think, fully feeling like I have my full weight as a filmmaker and understanding what the process is and how to manipulate audiences in a way that I think was more instinctual when I first started, but now is instinct sort of balanced with craft and sort of the learning and growing in the craft. And so I think there's a richness about the humor, there's a richness about the point of view in Dope that wasn't there before. And a lot of that it just comes from being a filmmaker who's now 41 as opposed to 23 when I was shooting, when I initially shot The Wood. And so this, I was at a point when I wrote Dope that I really wanted to make a statement, and this statement in particular, and I was very confident about what I wanted to say. And so I put that down and went and made it, and never, not even thinking about what the result would be, but just really feeling like this is just something I really had to say.
Wow, because I would have thought that there's some calculation just in the idea that this is, if you made this movie maybe 15 years ago, it would have been a lot heavier. But this is a situation where none of the characters behave as if the weight of the world is on their shoulders, even though these are all really important things. There's agility, and this movie is very light on its feet.
Yeah.
And it's almost like you said, this is kind of a hard-won victory for you.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted it to feel light on its feet. And I really, in terms of telling the story, I wanted this to be both homage to the films that I loved as a filmmaker while I was in film school in the 90s that really felt exciting and character-driven and felt like events. They felt like, you were going to go on a ride. When Pulp Fiction came out and Boogie Nights hit and then, Bottle Rocket, these were all sort of really exciting films for me. And I would look at the storytelling and how they were told. And it was amazing that this was coming out in mainstream Hollywood. And there was a real renaissance that I think I wanted to pay homage to as I started making Dope, because I felt like those films are harder and harder to get made nowadays, and
as you know with this,
as I know with this, because it was very hard to get Dope made. But I wanted to really pay homage to that spirit, and so those films took you into really specific and weird and crazy worlds, and that's what film should do. Film is supposed to transport you, and whether that is the farthest reaches of outer space or the the inner cities of Los Angeles, you want to go somewhere you haven't seen before. And so I wanted to create a world that was my world, but felt rich and felt exciting and felt unique and very specific. And I think part of what I was dealing with in films like Brown Sugar was, creating universality, and sort of saying, here's the Black experience, it's universal, the American experience is universal, and here are familiar people in familiar films and familiar situations that you're used to, but I'm just going to populate that world with characters that are African American and people of color. I think with this, it was more about specificity and sort of saying it's what's specific about us and as a country that makes us great, and recognizing the specificity and still knowing that these characters might not be anything like you, but I can still relate to them. It was sort of the goal for me, as opposed to, look, they're just like you, so relate to them. It's a slightly different thing.
It's the treatment. My guest, who's broken from archetype to create a whole new kind of film for himself, is writer-director Rick Famuyiwa. His new film as writer-director is Dope. It's the treatment. There's more to come. Stay with us.
Head over to the KCRW store to shop for vacations, wine classes, frequent flyer miles, dinners, and more, all in support of KCRW. They won't last long. Check it out now at kcrw.com/store.
Welcome back. It's The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. My guest is writer-director Rick Famuyiwa. His new film as writer-director is dope. When we were talking, I was reminded of one of the events that could have been in a 90s film that's done in a very different way here and sort of speaks to the fact that this is a really fleet-footed kind of a film. You're not fighting heavyweight anymore. You're now fighting featherweight in this, but delivering more punches, so it works better, if I can torture a metaphor here, is the scene where there's, again, this could have been a 90s black film. There's a shootout in a club, gang member who's really dangerous, who's slinging and dealing drugs, and it's instead played for comedy, but not satire, but played for character comedy. With that, I almost wonder if you thought, I've got to put this film in so I can show people how I've changed as a filmmaker, but how the world has changed in this take on this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always sort of a personal statement you're trying to make with any film you're doing, and
is there? Because this feels a lot more personal than did My Family Wedding.
Our
Family Wedding, rather. That feels much more personal than that film is.
Yeah, and it does, and I think in Our Family Wedding, which is your previous film. That was my previous film. You know, it was one of those things where I felt like I had there was a story I wanted to tell, but I don't think that was. But you're telling it really in like almost broad strokes, bold strokes, I should say, like really archetypal terms. Yeah, exactly. And I wanted this in terms of, I wanted this to sort of be a reaction to that in many ways, in that was a film that I think brought me to dope in some interesting way.
How so?
In Our Family Wedding, it didn't have enough there for me to tell this kind of story I wanted to tell. And I think it was sort of a clash of ideas I had in my head with the conventions of what a sort of broad family comedy needed to be. And so it got me to a place where when I was thinking about what I wanted to do next, I said, look, I need to go back to doing what got me in here in the first place, which is writing about stuff that's personal to me, writing about things that I have a connection to, whether they be big or small, and just fighting like hell to get those movies made.
For me, that scene, it's one of the most exciting things I've seen in a movie in a long time because it does so many different things. And the idea of bringing both, I should say, filmmaking velocity and dealing with that in conceptual terms is something I have not ever seen in the film.
Well, thank you. I was trying to do something different there, and I was trying to sort of comment on that. And yes, there's that scene is pretty familiar when you talk about the scene in the burger joint where the guy walks in and the Crips come in and they start firing up the joint. And again, I think I was just looking at that scene, and it was a tough scene for a lot of people. When they first read the script, they were like, "Oh my God, there's this shootout, and this kid gets shot."
And how do you play it? How do you play it for tone? And when you say it's comedy, people must go, "But no, it can't be comedy."
Yeah. They were like, "My goodness, how could this be funny?" And it's not that that the situation itself it's funny. It's more about the point of view of these kids who live with this day to day, and so. In their minds, you hear about this kid who gets shot, and they know he has this, again, comic book collection. It's self-interest, and that's what they're thinking about. It's like, well, that he does have that,
it's the
first
treatment.
issue.
It's the treatment. Please don't leave your first issue of Luke Cage here over hire with my guest, Rick Famuyiwa, whose new film is dope.
Yeah.
But that ideal that we're talking about, I mean, this seems to be about the generational shift or the generational difference between the institutions, whatever they be, the independent or studio that make movies versus people like you, not people like you, who are making a black movie that both has to work as an entertainment but has to work in terms of serving up the ideas and keeping those ideas afloat and spinning all simultaneously. And for me, that's the excitement of the film. I just wonder if there was any point when you were writing it that you thought, maybe I should just go the safe way and play these moments that are melodramatic for the melodrama instead of like saying, well, no, I mean, it's so absurd that this is still happening as to be slightly surreal.
Yeah. I mean, that was the point. And as I was writing it, there were those moments when I said, this is crazy. There's a lot of stuff in this movie that's really out there. and just hasn't really been presented this way on screen. But I was committed to that. I was committed to that idea that there is a way to tell this story that feels fresh and innovative, but also not,
not heavy-handed.
Not heavy-handed. And
not melodramatic.
Yeah. And I think, it'll be interesting as people digest it as it comes out and people get to see this thing, what the full reaction will be. I think most people are getting it.
I think people do get it because I think
yeah.
what it does is it works almost like music does, and that music goes through ideas now so fast. And even that way that hip-hop in the 90s did, where it was sort of creating these ideas and creating these archetypes. In fact, all that sort of 90s sort of hip-hop bravado was a spin on what had been the images of African Americans prior to that.
Yeah, exactly.
And music gets to work that much faster now because it's still not as expensive to make music as it is to make a movie.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting you say that because I felt like my approach to this in many ways was like an album,
It does feel like that.
And I felt like I was making a hip hop album in some ways as opposed to a film. And in an album, and especially a great album, there are, you'll listen to the first track and it'll be about love, and then you go into the second track and it'll be about, me and my boys going to do whatever. And then police brutality and everything in between. And so each track took you on sort of journey. And when you were listening...
But that 90s, which I think is kind of lost in a lot of people, all that great 90s hip-hop did have that gallows humor you're talking about, which never translated to film.
Yeah, exactly. And if you think about, Ice Cube's first album, and
you think about America's Most Wanted.
Yeah, America's Most Wanted. And you think about that album and he goes through his sort of experiences. It was... The commentary on that was hilarious and it was funny and you laughed at that. And, and when you got to JD's Gafflin and he's talking about jacking people at, drive-thrus, and it's this guy who's speaking in this just, amazing Los Angeles accent that a lot of people were like, is this guy from Alabama? And it's like, no, this is L.A. But it was, it was just an amazing album. And I remember when I listened to that, and you listen to like Gangster Fairy Tale, no one really does that on film. I think because the filmed image is so powerful, and because there's been such a history of blacks,
really.
Yeah, exactly, and how blacks are seen in this media and seen in images and media. That there's a safeness and there's sort of there's a fear in film to kind of push it in the same way that I think musicians don't feel that same fear.
So much of this is, let me ask you this as kind of a last question. So much of this is about not being in the control of us, of people of color, that reductive ideal of the black tragedy still has to exist in movies. And when something like this, when dope comes along, people are still blinkered by it, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, we're still fighting sort of a very long history of black representation. And
we look at Baltimore right now, which is happening as we're recording this.
Yeah.
There's still, and I look the way that all the news networks are dealing with that, there's still this sort of reductive way instead of like saying there's a bigger world now, there are lots of other issues going on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's the way we, again, consume information. I mean, I lived in L.A. during the L.A. riots after, the Rodney King, and that was a much bigger and more sustained and more violent sort of insurrection, rebellion than what we've seen. And I think it's, and I'm going to get myself in trouble with my humor, but I look at it and I was like, look, I lived through a real riot, you know what I mean? It's like as much as I look at some of the stuff, I'm like, this is terrible, yes, but I'm like, L.A. riots, Watts riots, and those were riots. Those were big. There were real energy and sort of damage and destruction and the sort of frustration coming from it. And I think I understand, and I definitely still feel that today. But I think there's so many other things going on in the world that we all focused on L.A. riots when that happened. Now there are hundreds of things that people can focus on, and so when stuff happens, it becomes a hot thing for a minute, and then we sort of dismiss it, and that's part of the sort of the balance that we're all dealing with. And so there are many things, sort of growing and fomenting beneath the surface that I think were around in the 90s, right before, L.A. exploded, and we're seeing them sort of pop up in random places. And there's an anger, there's a level of disenfranchisement, there's a level of frustration that I think we're starting to see pop up, and so Dope is kind of coming around in the middle of all of this, and even as I was writing and thinking about the film, this was very much
There's a moment of Shameik wearing your star, Shameik Moore wearing a hoodie. That's a moment to sort of, by the way, remind people that there still is something serious at stake that you use in the movie. So it's not you're not. I want to make this clear that you're not just using this as a way to just sort of make fun of things.
No.
There are moments of real weight, and that sequence is a reminder that just because these things are happening and these kids have a sense of how absurd it is, that they know that there are lives at stake. And that by being a black person wearing a certain garment, that you're making a statement.
And that was a very purposeful moment, and one that I was building throughout the film, because back to our talk about perception versus reality, I knew that the perceptions of who these kids were or are to a lot of the audience would allow them to go on this journey with them that in many ways is absurd, if you really think about it. But we sort of, because we have a history of what these films are, we go with them. And so that moment was really, just an acknowledgement that these kids are kids, and these kids have to deal with a lot of different things, and they're very much like your kids. And I had someone come up to me after the screening at Sundance and talked about that moment, and they were like, well, that was powerful for me because I realized that I loved these three kids that I was following throughout this film so much, and it connected for them that was like Trayvon Martin. He was just like, a lot of these kids that we have become iconic for the wrong reasons.
Are still just kids.
Are still just kids, are still just kids. And so, at the end of the day, that was sort of what I wanted to say is that, look, you spent the last hour and a half really having fun with these kids and having, a blast and seeing their sense of irony about the world. But they still live in that world where their lives are very much at risk, and I make fun of it and I have fun with it, but it's very real, and that was very much a part of what I wanted to say is that the lives these kids are living aren't like the lives that the kids in Superbad are living.
You
know what I mean?
And even though you get having fun with them, there's still basically kids with targets on their back. Rick, I'm so sorry. We're so out of time. You've got to come back and do the show again.
I would love to. Thank you for having me.
Completely my pleasure. My guest, whose new film as writer-director is Dope, is Rick Famuyiwa. The film is opening around the country. Please go take a look at it. I can't thank you enough for doing this. Really, thank you. Our recording engineer, who also mixes the show, is Melissa Morton. It's edited and produced by Jenny Radelet. That's why they call it, never mind. It's The Treatment. To catch up on past episodes of The Treatment, go to KCRW.com or listen on your smartphone with KCRW's mobile apps, or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.